Hello everybody. Welcome back. Just a quick reminder that we don't have class next week. So this is the last class prior to the reading week. So we'll come back in 2 weeks. Thank you for taking the test. Think about the next test as we go through the next material. So we're going to finish with this presentation on the Civil War and continue on with aspects of the Civil War and then on into the period of the late 19th century. This is where we left off last time with the growing sectionalism, regional divide between the North and the South. And you could say that the conflict over slavery was the starkest point of division between the northern and southern states, since that is typically considered the main dividing line, led to the Civil War. Though I say there, this was a conflict that went beyond simple good versus evil binaries, which is sometimes how it's presented in contemporary culture. The northern Union states wanting to abolish slavery and the southern Confederate states wanting to maintain it. Well, the situation was much more complex than that. For one thing, the main drive, the impetus towards abolition was coming not just from the North per se, but mainly from African Americans in the North, those who had escaped from slavery or those who were just freed people. Frederick Douglass, someone I didn't mention, is one famous figure, an abolitionist, but there were numerous others with their stories, their narratives about the conditions of slavery, providing a kind of driving force. So it was more like pockets or individual groups within the North. And in terms of the idea of the Southern preservation of slavery, well, as I mentioned previously, the slavocracy, as it was often called, had organized itself into a pyramid shape where those who were really benefiting from the system formed a minority class anyway, but certainly a very weighty and powerful minority class who were worried about losing their property, if nothing else, because they had their money, their property invested in the ownership of people. And also, the other thing that I mentioned too, the symbiotic relationship between the North and the South, at least on economic terms. So notwithstanding cultural divisions between them, it was the plantation culture in the South, the growth of a crop, cotton, fueling the industrial revolution in the North, especially with textile factories. So it wasn't as though they were completely separate realms. They were closely intermeshed in this symbiotic relationship with each other. Continue on with flashpoints. Well, there almost was the war occurring sooner than it actually did in 1850, where the American government just managed to head off the outbreak of war following a interestingly momentous event, and that was the discovery of gold in California, which provoked the California gold rush. I say there in 1848, workers near Sacramento discovered gold. They were just working, building a mill, discovered flecks of gold in the soil. And initially there was an effort to keep that discovery secret, but word leaked out, as it tends to do. And within a very short period of time, the bustling port city of San Francisco had become a ghost town as people rushed into the Sierra foothills to try to strike it rich, to try and pan for gold, to search gold, to dig up gold out of the ground. The president of the United States, James K. Polk, later confirmed the rumors. There were all sorts of rumors that used to sort of dribble back in to the eastern United States from out west, sensationalistic discoveries or all sorts of promises of instantaneous wealth. That American dream ideal had taken hold in its own unique way. There was always this kind of promise of, if you just go to this place and do this thing, you will instantaneously become very wealthy. So initially, the reports of the discovery of gold were treated with some measure of skepticism, but when the president confirmed the rumors, well, then you had not just people who were already out west searching for gold, you had a giant migration of people from other parts of America flooding into California. And in one of those dramatic moments, there was even a big prop, a tea caddy filled with 320 ounces of pure gold, which arrived by a special agent in D.C. So hundreds of thousands of people, colloquially known as 49ers, That's where the name of the San Francisco football team comes from. Journeyed to California, making various treks either overland or by sea as well. In some cases, sailing all the way around the Americas, all the way around the tip of South America and back up the coast or inland across Panama. And many of them died en route. It's not clear how many, probably about 20% of them, including in a major cholera epidemic. And so these people arrived in California, and there was this kind of entire mythology, this ethos that built around this era where you could just sort of walk out into the countryside, into the foothills, and you would just see gold glistening there on a riverbed, that it would be very easy for people to become wealthy quite instantaneously. Well, not so. I mean, some people might have struck it rich, found the coveted gold they were looking for, but most people, it was just a life of toil and hardship and disappointment. I would say the event seems to have set a trend for California as a whole. I mean, this was at the extremity of the Americas, but I like these sorts of intersections where you see the way these cultural narratives persist across time, because first it was gold. That was basically what led to the rapid population of the west coast of America. I mean, there weren't that many people there previously, some settlers, Native Americans as well. Well, then you have this flood of people searching for this one valuable resource, one valuable commodity. Later, it would be petroleum, particularly around Los Angeles. There was a giant oil boom that happened in LA, and you had a bunch of speculators and prospectors rushing into that region and leading to its rapid development. And these days, it's the home to the American entertainment industry. It's the home of Hollywood. And you have a similar kind of dynamic. You have a lot of people who go out to California hoping to break into the entertainment industry, wanting to be on television, wanting to be rich and famous. And how many of them actually make it? How many of them find this coveted resource that everyone wants? Most of them probably only know toil, hardship, and disappointment. So, I mean, I like these kind of connections that stretch across centuries. It kind of set a trend for what that state would become in the long run. You could say that initially the familiar image of the Wild West seemed to apply to California. The population swelled quickly until it was larger than either Florida or Delaware, so states on the eastern coast. And it became this kind of chauvinistic cesspool of money, grubbing, and violence with this kind of arbitrary lawlessness which descended on the state. All these different people looking to become rich quickly, and those looking to defend their territory, such as it existed at the time. And immediately there was this kind of call for some kind of law and order, which at this point basically entailed making it a state. So you suddenly had a lot of people living there. There was this idea, well, California thus should be one of the states of America. But the big question was, and this takes us back to the Civil War, would it be a free state or a slave state? Would it be a kind of northern state or a southern state? Well, the balance of power seemed to favor it becoming a southern state, except the vast majority of people who were there, not to mention the American government, did not want that. They didn't want the land to just be converted into this plantation dynamic held by a small coterie of people. They wanted the land to remain free, not really for egalitarian purposes, but just so that they could exploit the land. If you keep the land free, well, that leaves it open for not just pioneers and settlers, but also corporations to enter there and to develop it as well. So the real push was for California to basically be a free state, and a free state at this point meant a place that could be subject to industrialization and corporatization instead of being incorporated into this plantation model. Well, there was a compromise reached in 1850. Again, the country kind of teetered towards war at this point over the conflict of California. And as you can see there, marked in blue, it did indeed become a Union northern state, as did those clustered close to it. But you could see that a balance of power was clearly tipping towards the north. There you see basically the breakdown of the states: red southern slave states, blue, the northern free states, those in the borderland regions, the light blue. Again, the idea was to retain this semblance of balance, equal number of states, so they would have an equal amount of representation in DC. But as I said, for a long time, the North was becoming wealthier, more populated. And so the move to include California was sort of turning that into a political tipping balance as well. It's kind of solidifying what had already been happening. Well, it took 10 years before there was another triggering event, which was the election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860, which became a key catalyst for the secession of the southern states. Not the southern states declaring war, but actually leaving the Union. So departing from the United States and forming their own new country, the Confederate States of America. Lincoln as someone committed to the abolitionist project, and the Union seemed to be the person who was going to take definitive steps to begin to phase out slavery. You see a poster for a film about Lincoln starring Daniel Day-Lewis. Few Americans have had more written about them than Lincoln in terms of historical biographies and commentaries on his legacy. And few Americans have had more of a cult of personality built around them, meaning the valorization or idealization of someone from the past, with all the places that are named after Lincoln, and various statues and memorials. Of course, he's on Mount Rushmore, along with 3 other presidents. And this started actually quite quickly with his funeral, with his untimely death when he was assassinated 1865, right at the end of the war. And there was a giant funeral procession attended by millions, and a kind of entire national outpouring of grief. It was at this point that Lincoln became known as the Great Emancipator, the one who had signed the Emancipation Declaration, declaring the slaves to be free, at least in the states that were at war with the Union, and also the great martyr, someone who was kind of martyred for the cause of a unified America. However, that's a kind of simple narrative of adulation. Study of his life reveals a massive contradictions, which we can't really get into in much detail. But you would have to say that Lincoln was the model of the able politician who tries to play as many different sides as possible. Abolition wasn't necessarily at the top of his political agenda, although it certainly was a big concern, a big topic for him. He was vehement in his condemnation of slavery, but in his political rhetoric and his politicking, he tried to subdue that or keep that in check as much as possible. And in terms of promoting the abolitionist cause, at least in the North, he promoted ideals of free business, free trade, corporate life. Those were the kinds of ideals that he knew could appeal to a majority of individuals, a majority of people. So he was someone with that kind of focused business interest. And he was also someone who tried to appeal to the middle-class Americans, such as they existed at the time, while not leaving out the very wealthy as well. So someone who was basically negotiating and navigating the various different dynamics of American politics at this juncture. Always an important point to keep in mind. And I think I've basically raised this with some of the other individuals we've mentioned previously, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, these individuals who show up on money or have these monuments or these various places named after them. Well, when you look at them individually, look at their legacy, they are just people. Not gods, not these divine figures, not people who always made the perfect choice or always did the right thing, but just people, individuals, and very much products of their time, products of their culture, hemmed in by the circumstances in which they lived, and politicians, not saints. So that's, I think, an important point to keep in mind, because America has become, I think, famous for looking for those kind of messiahs, looking for those individuals who can do no wrong, who we're all supposed to worship after the fact. So the late 19th century, which is continuation in some respects of just what we were talking about with the Civil War. They're the topics, subjects we're going to consider. The outcome of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Ideal of manifest destiny, which I might have mentioned previously, but bears some talking about. That refers to the expansion of the United States into the West, and the Gilded Age, which is towards the end of the 19th century. The first subject, the outcome of the Civil War and Reconstruction, hints of modern warfare, why the North won, and attempting Reconstruction in the South. The Reconstruction era was 1865 to 1877, although that you could say was an ongoing project. So the Civil War itself, there you put up some numbers to give a sense of casualty rates. And the first thing that stands out is that this was a really big war by American standards, or really by any country's standards. There at the top you have total deaths, and you can compare that to the wars that had come previously, the War of 1812 and the Revolutionary War, which looked very small by comparison. This was really the confrontation with a death, carnage, and destruction on a large scale. And you can see even expanding total deaths from the wars of the 20th century, World War I or World War II, at least as far as the Americans were concerned. So when you talk about the Great War, often Americans think about the Civil War, because that was the war that was the most destructive for them and fought entirely on their soil, on their territory, which obviously since the Civil War has not been the norm. America has been involved in a whole bunch of different wars, but not in its own territory. You see numbers down there at the bottom giving the sense of casualties. Casualties means not just people who were killed, but also those who were wounded, captured, or who went missing altogether. And you see the numbers on both sides, somewhat even with the North, with more casualties. But what might stand out is, proportionally speaking, there were more casualties in the South, at least among those who served. You can see the numbers of people in the North serving, number of casualties, relatively small compared to the total number. With the South, it's almost even in terms of the casualties. Notice also in the North, the Union states, those who were eligible did not serve, because not all young men who were eligible actually entered into combat. Certainly class differences, simple wealth, family connections played a major role in determining who would actually be on the battlefield. You could pay to have someone go in your place, for instance, if you had the money. So you didn't need to serve in a war at this time. If you had the money, you could pay to send someone else to serve for you. There's a scene from one of the battlefields. As I said before, this war forced America to face a scale of carnage and destruction that it had not experienced before in warfare. Previous wars were not really an adequate preparation for this war. And this, in some respects, was a precursor to the wars that would follow in the 20th century, with the techniques of industrial warfare being introduced. Now, it was really in the First World War that the full scope of industrial warfare was unleashed, with the machine gun, the Gatling gun, for instance, poison gas used in the First World War as well. That was where you see the full effects of industrialization. Not quite on that scale in the Civil War, but there was certainly a kind of movement towards that, with the use of a more modern weaponry, more modern rifles, repeater rifles that could fire a couple of rounds per minute, depending on how quickly a person could reload it, and could also fire at distances of hundreds of yards, so it could hit a target that is quite far away. That gives a sense of more modern weaponry, but practice alongside what you call increasingly antiquated strategies. The typical strategy at this time was to line all your soldiers up in a row, or two rows rather, and so they'd be standing next to each other, shoulder to shoulder, raise their guns, fire at the enemy into distance, who would also be standing in a row, and then you'd have the people in the back row step forward, they'd have their guns loaded, they'd fire too, and you'd have this kind of movement back and forth. Now, the machine gun basically finished off that technique, because if you have a whole bunch of people lined up in a row, then you could just blast them all down with a machine gun. But this was a kind of combination of the possibility of industrial warfare with antiquated techniques. Machine guns can fire hundreds of rounds per minute, where at this point they were still using some older techniques. Medical treatments were primitive. That's why many of the people wounded in combat would die, because they didn't get proper treatment. And also the psychological impact of war on the individual was often ignored at this time. That would become another thing that would step to the fore in the 20th century with the First World War, with the discussions about shell shock, or post-traumatic syndrome from fighting in war. Shell shock basically means hysteria, from a response to being in a combat situation, being among carnage, bloodshed, and destruction and fear all the time. Well, there were no doubt those things that existed at this time. The psychological toll and impact that it had on soldiers being put in these situations. They didn't study such things at this time. They didn't take them into account. They figured, well, everyone could just recover mentally after the fact. Destructive, bloody war with 1.5 million casualties total. You add up the numbers proportionally speaking, about 25% of the participants would be a casualty in the war. Keep in mind that means killed or injured, sometimes grievously injured, captured by the enemy, or just missing altogether. The war raged from 1861 to 65, ending with the victory of the Union, the North. And here's another topic that has seen extensive coverage in scholarship and critical traffic, the question of why exactly the North won the war. Well, when you look at the circumstances, a better question to ask probably is, why didn't the South lose the war earlier? Because when you look at the sort of situation between the two sides, the North had just a clear advantage. So the remarkable thing in retrospect is that the war dragged on as long as it did, because it seemed as though the North should have been able to win quite handily early on. And that's really the kind of subject that's been debated continuously. Why should the North have won? Well, basically for the reasons that I cited previously. The northern states, the Union states, were becoming that industrial stronghold. And obviously battlefield tactics, strategies, the strategies adopted by military leaders, all of those things, the morale of the soldiers, all of those things are important. They count for a lot. But in a war, another thing that is incredibly important is just access to resources. And that's where the North really had the advantage. You have to have weapons, ammunition, clothing, boots, whatever it might be. Well, the North, being a place of industrial production, that's where they could churn stuff like that out. And not only that, with the vast railroad networks in the North, the transportation of resources was much easier to accomplish. The South, as I said before, still kind of an agrarian society at this time, a kind of rural countryside society. So that kind of level of production, of just fueling the war effort, keeping soldiers stocked and well in supply, that was much more difficult on their side. So the North should have kind of overwhelmed the South, and that, as I say, is what's debated, is why did the war last as long as it did? When discussing the outcome of the war, there's also the question of whether the Confederacy, the South, gained a distinct national identity, because it was a country, but it didn't last for very long. I mean, we're talking basically the duration of the war. Well, people have also debated this side and have questioned the degree to which there was a sense of national unity or solidarity just on the basis of the Southern or Confederate cultural identity. It's worth pointing out that not all people who lived in the South actually wanted to secede from the Union, wanted to leave the United States. You'd say overall there were two main strands of this identity did develop. One that was based on the future of slavery, and one that was based on the revolutionary past. Seemed as though, at least for those in positions of authority in the Confederacy, there was this idea that slavery was an ancient institution and that it wasn't going anywhere. In fact, that it had reached a level of development, if not perfection, in the U.S. South, and thus was worth preserving on into the future. The kind of paternalistic model of the plantation culture was often cited here. And so, if the North was taking this stance that slavery is this antiquated, abominable institution which is inevitably being phased out in favor of modern industrialization and republicanism, the South was taking the stance of, no, slavery has always been around, is here to stay, and is precisely in our territory that it's reached a certain level of development where it can be preserved on into the future. And the other strand was based on the revolutionary past of America, because here's another point that is debated, and you see the split in American politics today with one side or another claiming to reaffirm the revolutionary heritage of the United States, a country that was born out of revolt against a tyrannical government. At least that's how the American Revolution has been framed in retrospect. Okay, so what group of people are going to relive the ideals of 1776? Thomas Jefferson spoke about that as part of the necessary heritage of America. Revolt and rebellion against a government that does not serve the needs of the people. Well, you had the War of 1812, but that wasn't really much of a glorious war, considering it ended with basically the same borders in place. So a lot of the secessionists in the South claimed that, well, they were actually rekindling the American legacy, the true American legacy, which is through revolution and revolt against a tyrannical government. And so they tried to frame this as a kind of second coming of the American Revolution. And we see that today. I mean, how many times do you see ideologues across the political spectrum? And this speaks also to a kind of Trump is MAGA country ideology, the idea of we're going to rekindle America's revolutionary heritage or revisit 1776 today. However, notwithstanding the kind of attempt to foment this national identity, a kind of cultural unity, the Confederacy ultimately failed to gain recognition as an independent nation state where it counted. Well, from the Union, of course, for starters, because as soon as they seceded and became a separate state, that provoked a war which was designed initially to keep the United States together, but also failed to gain recognition from the British. There was a possibility that the British might enter the war on the side of the Confederacy, which might have had a dramatic impact on the fortunes of the war. Because if there had been a reprisal of 1812, if there had been a British invasion from up north, from Canada, from Upper Canada, well, then the Union would have had to fight a war on two fronts, might have made a significant difference in the fortunes of the war. But the British never entered the war. Not only that, but they didn't really formally recognize that the Confederate States were really a separate country. They just saw them as a kind of breakaway splinter state, which was going to be reincorporated into the United States soon enough. And again, it's something to think about in the present day context. Think about the war between Russia and Ukraine right now. Formal recognition of territory, annexation, different states and policies. Well, it's not just about the individual actors at that scale, but also the international community has to recognize or acknowledge something that has happened. Say there, the ongoing valorization of the South's lost cause has inspired numerous Confederate monuments and displays of the Confederate flag. Many Confederate monuments taken down recently, but certainly not all of them. There's still a whole bunch of these different monuments celebrating the legacy of the South. This kind of idea of the lost cause, the notion that the South's cause was in some way virtuous, that it was about individual freedom or individual state rights, which is an idea that continues to float around in American culture. It's also the kind of underdog narrative as well, a loser in a war that was defeated by a much larger and more powerful enemy. Also, of course, the display of the Confederate flag, which is flown in various places, was on state flags for a while, Georgia and most recently Mississippi, and also over the South Carolina Capitol. You see the Emancipation Proclamation issued by Lincoln on January 1st, 1863, which was basically an official acknowledgement that for the Union, the purpose of the Civil War was to abolish slavery. As I said before, there's been this, I think, selective rewriting a little bit of history with the claim that Lincoln's main bottom line was to abolish slavery all along, when in fact that was kind of one of several different purposes. Basically, at the beginning of the war from 1861, it seemed as though the main purpose of the war, as far as the Union was concerned, was to bring the United States back together again. The South had left the Union, had broken away, it splintered free of the United States. So initially, the Civil War seemed to be about repairing that break, that fracture. It was really towards the other end of the war that it became more explicitly about the abolition of slavery as a whole. And this proclamation is one of the kind of turning points, a document that basically provided the groundwork to free 3.5 million slaves located in those states in rebellion, basically the states that were involved in the war, which was not all of the slaveholding states at this time, but the majority. This, of course, did not mean that these 3.5 million people were freed immediately because they were still living in the occupied zones, but it basically meant they could be free if they escaped into Union Army quarters or even escaped to the north, and they would be freed after the war if the Union won it. I say there, the Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1877 in the South, was a period that attempted to determine what this freedom would entail. Because it's one thing to speak about this moment of liberation and the abolition of slavery, but then, okay, what exactly is the aftermath of that? Because then you have not just 3.5 million people, more like 4 million people total who were previously living in bondage in the southern states. Well, they're freed. Okay, then what's their status within the United States in the future? What kind of cultural assimilation and integration is going to occur in the future, especially considering the South was basically structured and set up as this plantation culture and society for well over 100 years by this point. Well, here we get into the idea of the kind of process of Reconstruction that would subsequently unfold. There you see African Americans voting in the post-Civil War era. Say there were African American candidates in subsequent state elections, though this was also a period of fraught opposition. And so there were kind of movements towards this idea of a civil rights impetus at this time, including various elections that were held in the American state. But there were all sorts of competing backlashes as well. Often when we talk about this era, this period of Reconstruction in the American South, there's this idea that the North attempted to impose this version of its own vision of civil rights onto the South. Well, actually, it was a kind of a sort of push and pull movement between different competing pressure groups at this time. Those who were supporting increasing civil rights, full-scale cultural integration and assimilation, those who were resistant to it from various quarters. This was the era of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the American South, a white supremacist organization which tried to roll back possibility of civil rights. For the majority of people in the South, and here we get into that question of what exactly did freedom entail, for the majority of people in the South, including African Americans, farming remained the principal occupation. So that's essentially what people were still doing on a regular basis. But in terms of freedom, well, there was the freedom from being treated as a piece of property, so a measure of personal autonomy, and also more migration. Not necessarily a lot of migration to the north, not at this juncture, but certainly more in the way of freedom of movement across the South, with people having the opportunity to seek out work for themselves, their own livelihood, choosing where they would go, basically following the routes to work and labor wherever it might be. Also, you could say much more in the way of family solidarity and communal solidarity, because following the emancipation, there was the opportunity to keep families together among African Americans. This was already kind of the trend, as I mentioned previously, towards the latter part of slavery, with that kind of paternalistic model that existed. But still, as I mentioned, slave marriages were legally non-binding, and families under slavery could still be broken apart. People could still be sold. Children could be sold. There would be no legal recourse to that. Well, following emancipation, thus there was a kind of more in the way of the unification of the family unit. And thus there was more in the way of a kind of centralized labor, because it was families working together, no longer just families working for some master who lives in the plantation. But still, nonetheless, I mean, in terms of the real change in living conditions, people lived as tenants on a share, credit, or cash basis. And for the most part, you had these different shacks that had been slave shacks previously were now converted into these tenant homes. So people would actually be paid for the work that they did, but they basically remained debt-ridden and cash poor. I say there, by 1896, 17 states in the U.S. had a civil rights legislation that protected the rights of African Americans, though enforcement was lax. So there was legislation and various laws that were passed in the northern states. For instance, in Massachusetts, New York, Kansas, places like that, there were actual legally binding legislation that was passed ensuring civil rights. But the issue was that for the most part, the penalties were weak, or the laws themselves were not regularly enforced. And thus, in the North, you had the growth of a lot of segregation anyway, notwithstanding civil rights. For a long time, you had these different pockets or different enclaves developing in cities. City like Detroit, for instance, is a kind of descendant, that legacy of segregation, with this kind of divided cityscape that emerged. So notwithstanding the actual legal rights passed in various northern states, there was still the element of segregation involved. And in the southern states, the movement between civil rights legislation was often fought with various laws, which would in time basically enshrine the Jim Crow laws of state-sponsored segregation, which I'm going to talk about in the future. In terms of the actual Reconstructionist project, what it was attempting to do, well, this was a kind of a short-lived thing. I say there, a succession of conservative governments swept to power in the southern states, beginning with Virginia in 1869. And for the most part, these governments ignored the possibilities of a biracial coalition and institutional development, focusing instead on reducing taxes for landowners and promoting railroad construction. So the opportunities for real civil rights, real equality, real cultural integration, those were basically ignored by this spate of conservative governments in the South, which basically brought the Reconstructionist project to an end. And also, I say their focus was less on the idea of institutional development. This had been originally the idea with Reconstruction in the South, bringing the American South back into the Union, but also focusing on the development of various institutions and apparatuses that would promote development there. And here I'm talking about schools or orphanages or even prisons, for instance, or asylums, those kinds of state-run institutions that kind of build up the infrastructure of a place. Well, that had basically been the idea for a while, but very quickly the kind of business model swept it aside, and suddenly it was just about reducing taxes for big landowners, those people who already own giant tracts of land, and also promoting railroad construction, which I'm going to talk about further. That's a very important thing as well, the way the railroads would become these crucial arteries for the distribution of goods and people. This kind of business model turned the South into a place of very contrasting levels of development and infrastructure. You did have something in the way of factory centers, urbanization growing up in the South, but it was kind of sporadic, and you had a lot of other places that fell into disrepair, or you had vast fields that were left empty that were not developed. You had continuously various groups of people who kind of slipped to the margins of Southern society that included the African-American workers, but also a lot of Southern whites as well. And it became this kind of hodgepodge of different levels of development. Reconstruction, in the end, the idea of rebuilding the South and kind of incorporating it into the Northern vision of America, ended up being this hodgepodge, chaotic, incomplete process, which left a lot of the South still in this agrarian agricultural state. So for a lot of it, it looked kind of the way it had during the Civil War era, with this kind of plantation look to it, and various people moving from place to place looking for work. Yes, so I'll talk about this after the break. So let's take the break here. We'll come back in 10 minutes.